in just a second. And I think we're live on all the platforms. So we are going to be streaming. We are streaming right now on a few different platforms. We are live right now on Crowdcast, which is where we're actually broadcasting from. And many of you are watching here on Crowdcast. We're also live on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter as well. So wherever you're joining from today, thanks for being here. And if you don't mind, just maybe pop in the chat box where you're listening in from today. I'd love to hear where the audience is and get a sense for where you all are, and any information you can share about your role or what you do. That's helpful too. So share a little bit about where you are and what you do. Love to hear from you on that front. And as we get going here, as I mentioned, we're going to ask you for questions too. So I have a few questions to get us started, but would love to get your all questions as we go here. So just to kick off the topic here and introduce our guest, like I said before, my name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage, and we do these live streams every Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern time in the U.S., which I think translates to, I want to say 9 p.m. in London, if that helps for those of you in Europe and other parts of the world. So 2 p.m. Eastern time on Fridays, we do these sessions and we try to cover different topics, have different guests, and we actually repurpose this interview for a podcast that we release every week. So you're getting to take part in a live audience here that will ultimately be spread out or pushed out to our podcast as well. So today's topic and today's guest is Brian Potts, who I'll let him introduce himself here in a second. We're going to talk today about software vendor sales spin and how to navigate that sales spin. We're going to hone in and focus on choosing an implementer and choosing a system integrator, but we're also going to talk a bit about navigating biases in the software decision as well. So it's sort of a dual purpose discussion that's relevant for both sides of the equation, whether you're choosing software or choosing an implementer. And we're going to cover some of those topics here today. So Brian Potts, thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me. Great to be back.
Yeah, it's been a few months since we've had one of these with you. So maybe just real quickly, give a little bit of background of who you are and where you came from and all that good stuff. Not going all the way back to childhood or anything. Maybe just start with adulthood and what you've done in your professional career.
No, it's a pleasure to be here. Chief Client Officer with Third Stage Consulting. My background is in, looking at from an agnostic perspective, looking at what it takes to transfer from current state to new state with technology. There's a lot that goes into that. The selection, digital strategy understanding, and then into the actual transformation itself of implementation, handling business processes, organizational change, people, data. And really my area of interest is identifying the needs up front and making sure that they're realized in the end. It's sometimes easy to say, here's what we want to do, here's what we need to do. But when you actually go to do it, it's a different story. So that's what I like talking about.
Good stuff. Yeah. And you see a lot of this every day, both with potential clients, with existing clients, and also interacting with vendors every day. So it's a unique perspective that you have and our team has as well. So just to start, and again, as I'm jumping in here with a few questions, I encourage the audience to please ask whatever questions you have, especially as we start to get into some of these threads and different topics here. I have a few questions to get the conversation going, but would love to hear your feedback from the audience here. Again, whether you're listening on LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitter, or Crowdcast, I'm going to be watching all the platforms for questions and comments. So I'd love to get your feedback there. But just to start, let's talk about this whole concept of software vendor biases. Just in general, whether you're talking to a software vendor to find out what the capabilities of the software are, and or if you're talking to an implementer of our system integrator to find out, how the software might work, or how the implementation may look. When a company is going through a transformation and they're trying to plan for a digital transformation, why is this bias a big deal? Or what are some of the high level challenges that organizations face as it relates to that bias?
Yeah, with bias, I think you want to look at what's driving bias. So two angles to look at. One, when you're talking to software vendors, implementers, somebody who's got something to take out of it, there's a financial bias. What's leading them to their beliefs? And they then inherently believe that belief create a bias because it benefits them personally. The other type of bias is from lack of knowledge. You don't know what you don't know, therefore you're creating bias based on uncertainties, unknowns. Kind of the go-to, what you Google, that becomes your first impression, and that all of a sudden is your bias. So there's bias with familiarity, when you don't know any better, and that's why we see a lot of internal bias. Companies that are looking to move to a new software from a legacy platform, a lot of people are stuck to that legacy platform because they know it, they're comfortable with it. The idea of change is scary. So that creates a bias where we don't necessarily want to change, regardless of what the new solution is or could bring.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think a lot of people, when they hear the word bias, or how do I become more objective, or get a more objective input into my evaluation of software vendors or implementers, whatever it is, I think people assume it's all external bias, but you bring up a really good point that internal bias is a big deal too. Just either through the lack of knowledge, or a lot of times it seems like project teams we work with are drinking the vendor Kool-Aid, so to speak. So they read something on the website, or a sales rep from a vendor tells them something, and they take it as sort of the holy grail of truth, and then that becomes their own bias internally. So you kind of have to watch for that as well.
Yeah, and that's it. You could get into the whole psychological concept of bias, but it starts as young. For those that have kids, you are the center of bias for a certain number of years. Whatever you as a parent says is gold, and that is the truth. Then it becomes teachers, and then it grows, and we get used to that idea of bias, and what certain, all of a sudden it's not the parents, and it shifts, but we get locked into what we believe is the source of truth, and that creates our bias. So keep that in mind as we're navigating where we're getting information from, and who's countering with different perspectives.
Yeah. I had an example of that just yesterday. We were talking to a potential client, and they're going through an SAP, or they're getting ready to start an SAP upgrade. So they're using ECC, which is an old legacy product of SAP, and they're looking to upgrade to S/4HANA, which is just the newer platform that they're operating on. And they're going to move to S/4HANA Cloud. And the whole one of the internal team members was saying how it's just a lift and shift. The code's all the same. The functionality is all exactly the same. We're just moving from ECC to S/4HANA, so it should be a pretty easy implementation. And I said, well, where do you get that information? He said, oh, well, SAP told me. And so he had to kind of unbrainwash him a bit and say, well, that's not at all true. None of what you just said is true. So we have to sort of dispel some of those understandings or misunderstandings. So I think it's a good point, but it's amazing how many people just sort of take it at face value and assume it's true if a sales rep tells you something. One thing that I'll just mention, that we already have some comments and questions coming in, which is great. So keep them coming. But I'm watching all the platforms here, and over on YouTube, Scott asks, or actually has a comment which ties directly into what we're just talking about here, and that is, he says, vendors outright lied to me during our search for an ERP. It was difficult to pick out when they would yada 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 over things because they can't do something. And then he kind of agrees with what we're saying here as far as the internal bias. So we already have one live participant who can relate to this, unfortunately, but it is a very common dynamic. What are some of the things that you find that software vendors, whether it's an ERP vendor or CRM, HCM, or whatever, software vendors, I don't want to say what do they lie about, but what are the biases that they impose on organizations that can be misleading or create confusion in the purchasing process?
Well, the big one is that we can do everything. One thing we throw caution to is when your vendor says, checks yes to everything, says no problem, yes, 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 you need to question, because that's never the case. There's always some gap. And the goal during procurement is to understand that gap. It's okay to have a gap. You need to know how to fill it. Well, I think a lot of what drives that is, again, it goes back to what we talked about earlier, two constraints that on call it software sales people. The first is that they're financially incented to say yes to get you as a client, regardless, if there's any way you can swing a yes, even if it's a sort of, you're going to swing a yes because it helps you financially. The other is the training that they receive. It's intentionally this way, is that we have the best software ever. You are on the number one team on the globe from a software perspective. Nothing can beat us. Here's why. That's the internal sales message that goes to the sales group that then gets transferred externally. So we're just carrying multiple versions of this is the best software ever. We can do everything. That becomes believed, embedded, because that's the source of truth that they have to go by. Sometimes you get a slightly different, salespeople can you can sometimes pick it out when they've been across a number of vendors. You can kind of catch them off guard sometimes if they've sold, multiple types of software, but especially those that are in their first software environment, they just don't know any better.
Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of what they're hearing from the sales vendors are what they want to hear, because that's the answer we all want to hear is it's going to be easy. It's not that much risk. It's not going to cost you that much. You're going to be so much better off with our software. I mean, that is what we're all looking for. So that it's understandable that you're sort of looking for that answer. And, when they give it to you, it's easy to believe if you don't know any better. One of the other things too, that I think is worth noting, you sort of touch on this, but maybe it's worth unpacking a bit more directly, is that, you have the software vendors who are compensated for saying yes and pointing out the strengths of the product. But then you also have an entire ecosystem of bias that's built around that. So you have a sales rep that's, yes, they're telling you, yeah, our software is great. It can do A, B, and C. We're the best thing since sliced bread. But then the real problem, I think, is not just that, because at least in that case, you kind of know and expect that person to be biased, and they're a sales rep and they're telling you what you want to hear. It's still sort of easy to fall into the trap of believing everything at face value, but at least, you kind of expect, some bias there. But I think the even more dangerous part of it is when you start to look at like industry analysts and the system integrators who are third parties, but they're all part of that same machine. They're all getting paid and supported by the vendor. So, these vendors like SAP, Oracle, and those guys, they spend tons of money paying Gartner and Forrester and those guys to put out the magic quadrants and all the stuff that tells you how awesome their software is. So I think that's another thing too, is, it's easy to say, well, the sales guy told me this and I just validated it by going over to Gartner and looking at the magic quadrant. So it has to be true. But behind it all is a vendor bias that's putting a lot of money into that message that you're not.
I love that example, because I run into that all the time, talking to software vendors. We are here in the quadrant. So to understand how quadrants are made, quadrants are bought. There's a quadrant for anything that you want there to be a quadrant for. They're created every day. They're rearranged. There's certainly some truth to them, but only to the degree that vendors are paying for their product to be in a certain spot. You have to bring in some comparable products, but it's a creation based on dollars. And there's quadrants for literally everything. Any software vendor can find themselves at some top angle of a quadrant.
Yeah. It is. It's always fascinating. Some of the most random quadrants that are out there, we're in the top right corner of the magic quadrant for business intelligent providers that focus on mid-sized manufacturing among all software vendors based in Pittsburgh. It's like it's something very specific that only
I haven't seen that one.
Well, I'm exaggerating, but obviously, but that is sort of how it works, is you have all these different quadrants that are being commissioned. And it's not just Gartner. I don't want to pick on them too much, but Forrester, the other analyst, the system integrators certainly are biased because they're trying to sell software because they make money on the commission of the licenses they help sell, as well as the services to go along with it. So, that's an important point as well. So let's shift gears and look at just a little bit, or not shifting gears so much, but looking at one other specific thread within the whole concept of bias here, and that is with system integrators. So, first of all, let's talk about what options organizations have when they're choosing an implementation partner.
So, a good consultant answer to that is it depends, but understand that there's a whole range of availability for system implementation. In some cases, you've got the vendor direct. Now, sometimes, look at the cases of the larger players, SAP, Oracle, they'll only work with certain size or verticals that they want to put focus on. And this is always shifting as well. Microsoft doesn't do much of their own work, if any. They'll shift everything to a reseller group. So the second, outside of the software vendor, where you're working directly with the manufacturer of the software, you've got the value-added resellers. Those are ones that can resell the license and implement the software. They've got a license agreement with the software vendor to basically facilitate sales and implementation of their product. Sometimes in that the value in some of those is sometimes they'll bring that true concept of value add, where they're building their own IP or capability on top of the core software package. So you look for those in cases of verticals where you need specific functionality that's built in addition to the base software package. Then you've got the system implementer arena, which is they may not sell the software, but they're contracted to implement the software and maintain it. So you in some cases you can buy the software from the manufacturer and implement it through another group. Sometimes it's the same group. A lot of times, resellers and system implementers will represent multiple packages. Sometimes they're dedicated, but a lot of times they'll have. You look at the top accounting firms, for example, they'll have 4 or 5 of the big players that they implement, and that's a whole nother issue. Getting to bias when you're going through a software evaluation is they're going to be led to one of the products they support. The other alternative that you've got is to try and do it yourself and bring in 1099s and certified resources. It's sometimes difficult to navigate, but anymore, it's so hard to find system integrators that have resource availability. That might be an option. You can get somebody dedicated, bring them on staff. You've got their full attention. You do need to make sure that they've got the capabilities of certification to handle the software, but there's some option to build your own team, essentially.
Yeah, and it's a great point, and it's not mutually exclusive. I mean, it's not like you have to pick one of those options. I mean, you could do a hybrid where you have a core system integrator, or you augment it with some 1099 contractors or whatever the case may be. But I think a lot of, again, getting back to this whole bias concept, the system integrators will tell you that is a terrible idea. You should not bring in independent consultants. You should not bring in your own resources. You shouldn't be doing this yourself. And some of that is partially true. I mean, you do need the outside expertise and people that do this for a living, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it all needs to come from the system integrator. It doesn't mean that you can't have other resources that you bring in from the outside. You could hire your own people, to be on your staff too, as full-time employees. That's another option. So I think it's important for organizations to not be scared by the scare tactic of don't hire anyone but us to do the work, because that is, I think system integrators are very protective about their turf. Like, this is our project. We're going to bring all the resources. You can't bring in your people and intermingle with our team.
Yeah, and be ready for the liability discussion when you talk about that, because they're going to say, oh, well, then we're not liable for anything. That's not true. Right. And just push that aside. And you do want to look at where responsibilities lie, but you do have options.
Yeah. Yeah, very true. Yeah, thanks. That's a good overview of the different types of implementation options. And I think a lot of times people get, the terminology can get confusing too. A system integrator, VAR, implementer, vendor, what do all those terms mean? I think the key there is, you have options. It's somewhat interchangeable, but as you mentioned, there's the VAR, some of the VARs have their own IP or their own value add to the product itself. What about just shifting gears or kind of moving on to another related question, but why is choosing the right implementation partner or partners or resources in general, why is that so important? I'd go beyond that. It's probably as, if not more important anymore than finding the right software, because this is the team that's going to implement the software. This is the team that needs to know your business, understand your business, and tie the software to your business. And then that's ideally the group that is going to be your support ongoing. So this is your face to the software, essentially. You're buying a software, but the actual perception of the software is this integration group, this team that's going to be supporting you. So validating that and identifying that correctly is extremely important. Yeah. Absolutely. And it's, there's technical competencies and capabilities you have to evaluate, but, culturally, you want to make sure it's the right fit too. What about, when you think about the different tiers of implementation partners, whether they're VARs or system integrators, you have the big guys, you have the boutique smaller guys, you have the mid-tier providers. How would you just sort of summarize or generalize the differences or the strengths and weaknesses between those, major buckets of options?
Yeah, I mean, with the larger system implementers, it's it's easier to get overrun on a project. They tend to be more expensive, possibly giving you more than you need. The benefit is they tend to have fairly structured methodologies, and they tend to have better access in some cases to resources. One thing I do want to comment on resources before I go on is understand right now that there's extreme limitations globally on system implementation resources. Everybody, for the most part, is reaching from the same pools. So don't listen to your software if a implementer is coming to you saying, "Oh, we've got access to these exclusive resources," unless they're W-2s currently. That's not true. So they're all reaching from the same bucket. So the larger players with the marketing and the HR staffing capabilities can probably grab some of those people a little bit easier than some of the smaller players. With that said, as you move down, some of the called the small boutique implementers, they tend to have more vertical focus. They tend to be targeted, whereas the bigger ones will say we can handle anything. They've got some varied experience in most verticals. It might not be terribly targeted, but they've done a project or two pretty much everywhere. The smaller players are usually chosen for very specific vertical needs. They've got direct experience that ties to an industry, to maybe a geography if it's a localization, and they ideally will bring resources that can very carefully focus on your project specifically. The danger there is they don't have a lot of people, so bandwidth, availability of resources. If they lose somebody, it can be very damaging to your implementation. Again, they can go out and try and recruit people, but they probably don't have the budgets. They don't have the reach that some of the larger firms do. Then there's the mid tiers, which is a hybrid of those. We generally find a lot of the larger ones might have alternative services that they offer, accounting firms, or they have a bunch of different things they offer. Usually that mid tier tends to focus on system integration. They usually will have multiple packages that they work with. They'll work with a variety of tiers. What I've seen, and I'm curious, Eric, what you think, it seems to me that this is the group that has pretty strong bias for the parties, the vendors that they're working with, meaning they will go out of their way to make SAP, Microsoft, Oracle, Epic, or whoever it is look really good, so that they get more market share funneled to them through the vendor leads. You risk that in any case, but I've seen those kind of in that spot of, we really need to shine, because the big players they're given, and they're not really dependent on that income stream necessarily. They got people who are really eager in that division, but those mid tiers, and I don't want to put names out here, but they're really stretching to become number one, number two in a particular software market.
Yeah, and those mid tier companies oftentimes are the ones that get the more senior people. The people that perhaps worked at one of the big consultancies, they got burned out on that environment, and end up going to a smaller mid tier provider, and so that just track record, or that history or tenure in a certain space, does create a certain amount of solidified bias, that's even more strong. So that could be part of it. But I agree with you. It's pretty pervasive it's pervasive with the big guys like the Deloittes and Accentures of the world. They're all pretty, hell-bent on the type of software they want to push. And but the mid tiers, I'd say I agree with you. I think it's even more pervasive there.
Yeah. And and I know we like to bash software vendors and implementers. It's kind of fun. You need these guys, and you need them on your team, and you need to find the right one. One thing you cannot use any of these groups for is software selection, just to be clear, because they are, going back to bias, they're pushing whatever it is they support. Even if they have 5 packages, I get a lot of response on those top tiers you mentioned, Accenture, Deloitte, some of those, where they do software selection. They say, oh, well, they represent the 3 packages we're looking at. Microsoft, SAP, and Oracle usually come, sometimes Workday, Salesforce. They represent all of those. But keep in mind that those software vendors will funnel different incentives their way for certain types of projects. If they're breaking into a new vertical, for example, and we just ran across this with one of the big software vendors, when they're breaking into a new vertical, they send unique incentives to the system implementer, so that they're going to hopefully grab their attention to create bias for a software evaluation.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a great point. And I've seen plenty of situations, I think you have too, where, Deloitte, Accenture, Capgemini, those guys that maybe technically they do have, say, an SAP and an Oracle practice. And so in theory, you could evaluate both systems. But what they'll do internally is if you're hiring them for the system integrator, they don't want to compete with one another. So a lot of times they'll kind of rig it to where, they have a bias for whatever reason. Maybe it's economic, like you just said, or maybe it's political. There's internal political dynamics, or they've got a bunch of people on the bench for one product. They're gonna push one narrative that is a clear answer based on all those things, some or all of those things that you just described. So I think that's an important, really important point. We see it all the time. It's almost like they rig it themselves because they don't want, they don't want 2 or 3 different groups within the same company all fighting and consuming resources to compete for the same opportunity when they could just, have one clear favorite and focus on that one.
In a lot of industries, that's illegal, but it's perfectly fine here in the software world.
It's actually a great point. I mean, there's a lot of things that happen in this industry that would never fly in a business to consumer type of environment, or even, we were right before we went live here, we were talking about what a racket, general contractors and home improvement, that whole industry is sort of a racket as well. But I put the ERP and the enterprise software space right up there as one of the more corrupt or ethically challenged industries out there. Here's a question from Sam Graham from Spain, who's a frequent listener and participant in our content. So welcome again, Sam. Good to see you here. And his question is here: if using a system integrator, some of their people are going to be less experienced than others, and perhaps even new to the software, how should buying companies deal with this?
If the users,
if some of the consultants that are being proposed by a system integrator are less experienced or maybe even new to the software, how do you deal with that when you've got some more junior people on a project and maybe not the best that you feel like you deserve for a project? How do you
well, that's a tough one, and that goes back to having the focus of the system integrator, because we're seeing a lot of this. I mean, they're hiring like crazy, they're training like crazy, but if you get somebody who's got one implementation under their belt, how confident are you that they can lead your full implementation? In an ideal world, what you've got some senior leadership that's helping to train them. That's kind of the norm, but then you've got multiple resources. If you're a small mid-sized company, you don't need multiple resources. So I would actually tend to use that identification as part of the selection for a system integrator. If they're proposing somebody who maybe came over from another software, you're going to need somebody else to support. They maybe understand the project management, the general protocols for implementing software, but in terms of the specifics of design and build of a particular platform, they're going to need some help. So I would actually usually would recommend doing some interviews and understanding who the team is as part of your implementation, because that will slow things down.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it brings up maybe even a bigger point, which is no matter who you hire, whether it's one of the big system integrators that are notorious for bringing on, young kids. And that's, to be fair, that's where I started my career. I was one of those young kids that knew nothing about ERP, and they hired me, and I, got put on a project right away. I was arguably not delivering the value that I was billing the clients, but that was the way it was. But so that's their model. They groom people out of college to, develop, and the average person stays for 3 or 4 years, and then they leave and move on to go somewhere else. But so you get a relatively young consultant base with these larger system integrators. But whether you're looking at a large system integrator like Deloitte, Accenture, Capgemini, or whether you're looking at a mid-tier provider, you do have a right as a customer to rationalize and challenge the staffing. Why do I have the kid straight out of college, or someone that it just got certified last month in the technology? Why would I want to pay $150, $200 an hour for that person when they arguably don't know what they're doing? So I think that's the kind of granularity that organizations should be getting more into, is to rationalize and validate the cost proposals, to say, do we really need all these people? Do they need to be here full time for X amount of time? Can we stagger it more? Can we rationalize the team, the mix of people, all that stuff? It's your project. I think that's the key. I think a lot of times system integrators will create this perception that you're the client, you have no idea what you're doing as it relates to the software. We're the experts. Just trust us. You need 20 people on this project, and half of them are going to be straight out of college. And it's sort of like and I'm exaggerating, I'm being a bit tongue in cheek, obviously, but I think that's the sort of bias that you get from the system integrators often. And again, to be candid and transparent, I was part of that machine, so I was on the other side of it. So I was guilty early in my career of being part of that as well.
Yeah, and sometimes you just can't avoid that. One thing you want to look for is it goes back to interviewing the people you're going to be dealing with. If you get call it a young kid, and frankly, some of them are a lot smarter than the senior people that I've met because they're eager, but look for that excitement in learning a new project. We all agree that they're learning on this project, but they're excited to do that. They want to be part of your group and take ownership of it. That's okay. As long as they've got the support that they need, when they don't know something. On the other end, just into looking about cultural fit and interviewing implementers, sometimes there's a lot of demand right now, and we're starting to see a lot of integrators. Resources are just becoming essentially burned out, and there's a lot of very senior people who, when you talk to them, you can kind of get the sense they don't want to be on this project. They're doing it because they have to. They've gone back to back since 2019, and just with all the demand and for new systems, you kind of be cautious of that too, because that can slow you down. So you're never safe with just getting somebody. Make sure you understand who it is, and that you help to. Ideally, you have to help own and build the excitement for this implementation with the implementer.
Yeah. Yeah. And also remember too, again, thinking about what motivates people, where might that bias, even if it's unintentional, where might that bias be coming from? And with system integrators, you have to watch for the bias of staffing people on a project full-time now. So it's a lot more advantageous for a system integrator to get you a team in place, as many people as possible, as soon as possible. So what you have to do as a customer is push back and say, do I really need 20 people to show up on Monday? Today's Friday, they're going to all show up on Monday. Am I ready for 20 people? What is that going to mean to my run rate? My budget, my run rate. Maybe I stagger it a little bit more. Maybe, we have a smaller team that is on site for the first few weeks until we get our ducks in a row. Maybe we don't even bring in the system integrator for a certain period of time. And in fact, I have a video coming out next week that covers that exact topic of why you should delay hiring your system integrator until you do those minimum prerequisites that you should have done before you start engaging with the system integrator. And most system integrators would disagree with that, say, no, you want to speed things up. You need us there tomorrow or on Monday. And that's the sort of dance you have to do with some of these integrators as well. There's a couple other questions here in comments. I'm switching over here to LinkedIn, where there's quite a few comments coming in. There's a comment here. I don't know if it's a question, but maybe you have a comment or a reaction to this, Brian. But the comment on LinkedIn is from Praveen, and he says core fit solutions for verticals, which every SI claimed to cover, but that isn't the case. So is that a topic you've seen, sort of accelerators, best practices, pre-configured solutions for certain verticals? The SIs say they have it, but oftentimes that's not true. I'd argue more often than not that is not true. But what are your thoughts?
Yeah, we hear that a lot. Oh, we've got you covered. And even at some of the large software conferences, you'll see they have, here's our solution for this, this, and this. What you want to understand about the core solutions is that they're built based on previous experience, and every implementation is unique. Mm-hmm. Every company is unique. You're not going to map, if you map exactly to your competitors, then why are you doing, you're just washing out the market. That's anti-business. You want to target this and use best practices where available. So there's a certain percentage of those pre-built best practices, core applications that are going to work for you, but you don't want to just rest on that. So when a vendor says, hey, we've got your industry covered, they probably have a percentage of it, but it's not a complete package. You're still going to have to build around that, do your full requirements, understanding of where you differentiate, and modify accordingly. Yeah,
absolutely. That's a great point that Praveen brings up, which is you want to watch for that bias as well. And it's looking at human behavior. It sounds good. It's what we want to hear. You're telling me that there's a pre-configured solution for my industry, so this implementation is going to be easy. It's not going to cost me a lot, and you're resolving or addressing some of my deep-seated fears that this project might fail, or it might go over budget or whatever, or I might get fired if the project doesn't go well. So I think that you just have to unpack that a bit to understand the dynamics there. And then Praveen also had a follow-up comment here I wanted to get to over here on LinkedIn. And I strongly agree with this comment, and that is that it's not the software vendor alone, but customers that must also start organizing their strategic planning and workforce for the implementation. What are your thoughts on that? Or, do you have any thoughts?
I love when there's an understanding that customers hold a responsibility too, because you can't just say, Mr. Software Vendor, come here and do everything for me. You've got a responsibility of an organization to understand what you're doing. And ultimately that leads to, I think we'll get to this in a little bit, but taking ownership of your project. One of the big risks with just hiring a vendor saying, okay, you got out of the box solutions, bring your team of 20 on Monday and get going. At that point, you no longer have control over your software implementation, the vendor does. And you want to make sure that you've got the controls in place, you've got everything prepped on your end. That's what you're talking about, that readiness piece as starting that. You want to keep hold of those reins through the implementation.
Yeah. And it's, you and I do a lot of, you and I and others on our team do a lot of public speaking and live events like this one and YouTube videos and all that good stuff. And sometimes it feels like we should just be motivational speakers. We should just go out and motivate people and say, this is your project. You can do it. You own it. Take responsibility. It's almost like you have to light a fire under the butts of people that are going through this project to understand, don't just defer all of this to the system integrators. Because, it is your project. You have to own it. Just like you and I were both talking before this discussion about us each having our respective remodels and home improvement type stuff happening with contractors. And, as bad of experience that you and I have both had with those situations, it really is, it's our responsibility, right? When something's not going well, we're not just going to keep throwing bad money after good, or good money after bad, whatever the cliche is. And you're going to, you're going to take responsibility, and you're going to redirect or pivot however you need to. And that's the way, organizations need to treat these projects as well. And you can't use the excuse that, well, I don't know how to do these projects, I've never done it before, or I'm not an expert. That may be true, but you do have to recognize enough of when you need to go a different direction or pivot off of where you are. So kind of building on that thread, but sort of shifting gears, one of the questions I had for you, Brian, is not too long ago, I guess it's been a while now, maybe a year and a half or 2 years ago, you wrote a blog about this concept of getting Accentured, and you could easily throw in, insert another SI's name in there. You get Deloitte, you could get Accentured, you could get Capgemini. You use it as a verb, and maybe it was sort of a humorous but serious take on this whole dynamic that we're talking about here today. But help us understand what you meant by that, and how that relates to some of the dynamics to watch out for.
Yeah, I'm still getting comments on that. It's sort of a forewarning. Understand that these larger firms, their model is to basically, that concept of taking ownership. They want to take ownership of this project and of basically your organization in a sense. So they've got tentacles in every department. I remember a specific case where we were providing some strategic guidance to an organization that had hired, call it the big A. And what we come to find is that they weren't only on the enterprise software side, they were also in the accounting side, they were in data management, they had groups planted, I don't say like a fungus, that sounds bad, but they were planted across an organization, and they were essentially driving the decisions of the organization because they were able to influence different departments to make decisions based on where they had influence elsewhere. You see in a lot of cases, there's another public organization that I walked into, and Deloitte had offices set up. It's becoming overwhelmed with a consulting group. You need that consulting group, you need their guidance, but make sure that you are maintaining ownership of your company, your organization, and your environment, and not just letting them run away and free bill and tell you what you need without your understanding and approval.
Right. Yeah. And I think it's, another thing that you see in this whole concept of being Accentured or Deloitte or, insert SI name here, is the focus on keeping others out. It's sort of a very protective, protecting the turf sort of approach or mentality where you can't. I mentioned before the whole concept of independent contractors and maybe augmenting your SI with independent contractors. Most SIs will fight that very hard and say, no, this is our thing. Because the minute you bring in another third party, suddenly there's a huge amount of transparency. And this happens when we get hired too, by the way. We're independent, we're agnostic. We do not care what software you do or don't implement. But what we do is we represent the client. So if we come in and start asking questions of, wait, why do you have 20 people on this project? What are these 20 people doing? And do you need all 20 of them? They don't want that. And so you have to recognize that too and say, they would rather fight off and keep someone like us or any other third party, keep them out of the picture, because then that suddenly they're accountable if they have to show that sort of transparency.
Yeah. And actually, that's a good point, because come to learn that several of these organizations actually have very specific trainings once you hit the manager level on how to keep others out of your account. Yeah. They're trained on that. And the way it's done is they're very, very good at what they should teach seminars on how they do this, but you build relationships with the key stakeholders, the C-level in an organization, make them your best friend, and every decision that is then made is funneled through you as their account rep. And usually that's done at the partner level, and it's very difficult to break in, because it's another created bias. Is essentially what they're doing, is that we are your trusted advisor. Come through us for anything. No, you don't need a separate quality assurance. We talk a lot about the idea of QA. Why in the world would you hire one organization to quality assure their own work? It makes no sense, but it happens all the time. And we've run into that numerous times, and it's especially the case with the larger implementation firms and auditing firms.
Yeah. We've had multiple larger clients, like multinational Fortune 500 companies, that will, in those cases, they will have a full-time account exec or account manager, and their only job is to focus on you, the client, and make sure that they're maximizing their revenue on that account, making sure that they, just keep their foot in the door. So they'll invest a lot of money to make sure that, you do things their way, and that they have a very sticky approach to their consulting in that way. Here's I'm trying to pick which one to go with here. There's a lot of really good comments and questions here. Some of them coming in here on Crowdcast now, but this one is from Amin on Crowdcast, and he says, as an ex-Accenture consultant, I've seen and worked with new hired employees getting assigned on client projects with basically no prior knowledge of SAP and acting as an expert. And then he said, I know what you mean by Accentured, LOL. So there's some validation from a former Accenture person there. So thank you for that comment and input. Another question here is from Safe on I guess this is on Crowdcast where this question came in. But at what stage do you think independent consultants like Third Stage should be engaged by the client? Should it be before engaging the system integrator? What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, it's ideal. You can say yes. I mean, ideally, you're working with an independent to help through the selection, which should include the selection acquisition of a system integrator. A lot of times, it's not realized, budget's not allocated. Things happen very fast. Somebody has made a decision. We're going to go with this group to implement software. So sometimes you don't have a choice. In which case, it's better to bring in support when you realize you need help. If you don't have the opportunity to do it from the beginning. But ideally, you've got support as you're creating your strategy, as you're going through the evaluation of technology. Because another thing to consider when you're talking to system integrators, they're going to make brash assumptions that you need more than maybe you do. So when one thing that we do in our evaluation cycle is determine what, in the case, ERP means, or HCM. There's a lot of different functional pairings that you might be buying that you don't need. You've got overlap with existing systems. In a case of a best of breed, we find a whole lot of overlap where you've got two heavy systems that can kind of do the same thing. If you're able to purchase and turn on and off functionality, great. But if not, you're spending a lot more money and adding complexity to the implementation, because integrating those things where they've got competing interests is also difficult.
Yeah, great point. And The one that I think we see the most often is for organizations that are implementing SAP S/4HANA as their core ERP system. SAP has gone out, for those of you that don't know, SAP has gone out and acquired a bunch of other technologies to augment S/4HANA. So they acquired Ariba a while back, which is a procurement supply chain management type of software. They acquired Concur for time and expense reporting, SuccessFactors for human capital management or HR. And what they do is they'll say, hey, these are all our products. You should be buying our suite of products. You don't want a third party, to have to bolt on to S/4HANA. But in reality, if you implement Ariba, for example, or SuccessFactors with S/4HANA, that is like any other third-party vendor. It just so happens that SAP owns it. But they'll tell you something different. They'll tell you that you need to use their product because it'll integrate better or be easier or whatever. But we just haven't seen that to be true at all. And it's, that's that same thing, not just SAP. You can say the same thing for a lot of these companies, especially the larger ones as well. Another comment / question here over on LinkedIn is from Satnam, and I apologize if I messed up your name or butchered it. But Satnam says, one of my employers wanted to hire a newly set up system integrator to help implement ERP, but they had a group of very skilled contractors who could do the job, but they preferred the SI because they thought there's less risk with the system integrator. What are your thoughts? I think there's risk either way, but if you already have the skills, then I would prefer contractors. They're less expensive, whereas with the SI, you don't know what you will get. So it comes back to the whole single system integrator that brings all the resources. And by the way, many of them are going to be independent contractors. They just so happen to be, under the contractor, under the umbrella of the software vendor. But what are your thoughts on that? I know we touched on it a little bit earlier, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's pros and cons in both directions there. If you're working with independents, a couple of the things you want to be wary of is you want to make sure that they have the certification. They might have the capability, but the certification authorization for new releases of software has to be maintained. The other potential risk of bringing the independent route is you've got multiple contracts to deal with, whereas with a system integrator, it's one throat to choke in a sense. Now, on the other end, you're going to be paying more for that. So it's a risk versus reward. You're not necessarily getting better service either way, but it's the simplicity of when you need help, how you navigate it. If you've got strong internal project management capability, that might steer towards, let's work with the independents. If you've got less internal capability to manage a project and resources, that would lead more to the system integrator, but then you're risking them taking over the project from you. So you might need to bring in depending on the size of the organization, complexity and all that, you might need additional third-party support. So what I would do is set up a pro and con, spreadsheet and just say, here's the benefits in each case and here are the risks, and kind of weigh it out, because it's not an easy decision. There's risk both ways.
Yeah, agreed. And I want to come back to your response on the question of whether or not you should bring in a third party or an independent third party before bringing on your system integrator. And whether it's, this is true, whether it's third stage you might bring on, or whether you try to do this yourself if you have the right competencies, the answer is the same. But one point I would make is that a lot of times what happens is you pick a software, whatever it is, whatever technology you're going to deploy, you pick the technology and there's a lot of momentum and excitement behind that. So people are ready for the change. And, usually you've got alignment on this is the direction we're going. And then what happens is that excitement gets combined with pressure from the system integrator or the software vendor of let's get started.